To defeat Nazi Germany, the leaders of the Allied forces had to make difficult decisions and commit atrocious acts. One of these acts was the bombing of Hamburg. For some, what happened in the German city was a war crime.
We're taking fire.
The raid was intended to undermine German morale, and it succeeded. Hospitals, schools, and churches were set ablaze. More than 5,000 buildings were completely destroyed, leaving over 100,000 people homeless who, once the bombing ended, had to begin tending to the nearly 5,000 wounded and bury the 1,500 dead. But that was only the beginning of Operation Gomorrah. But for others, it recalled the biblical passage from the book of Genesis, chapter 19, verses 24 and 25. Then the Lord rained sulfur and fire from the heavens upon Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord. He destroyed those cities, the entire plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and the plants of the ground. The operation was a military success, but at an immeasurable cost. Tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives as a result of the Hamburg bombings, which went down in history as Operation Gomorrah. Between 9:45 p.m. and 11 p.m. on July 24, 1943, 814 British bombers took off from airfields located in the counties of Lincoln, Cambridge, and York. 347 Avro Lancasters, 246 Handley Page Halifaxes, 125 short Stirlings, 85 Wellingtons, and 11 Mosquitoes took flight toward Germany. Their mission was clear: to unleash hell on the city of Hamburg. In Ostend, Belgium, a German station reported contacts near the east coast of the United Kingdom. Another Nazi radar station, located 125 miles further north on the island of Terschelling, warned that a large number of aircraft had taken off from Royal Air Force bases. The information quickly reached the Luftwaffe Defense Command Center, located underground in the city of Stade. From there, General Oberst Walter Schwabedissen ordered all night fighter units protecting the western regions of the Reich to take immediate action. But the German fighter controllers, among the most advanced in the world, received confusing information. The British vanguard continued its flight southward. But the rear seemed to be growing, as if the number of bombers multiplied every second. The confusion only increased. Now, the ground radars reported thousands of contacts, and the German night fighter pilots confirmed this information by observing the Liechtenstein radars on their planes. General Schwabedissen became desperate and began demanding answers. The controllers, under pressure, tried to obtain precise information from radar stations, listening posts, and reconnaissance planes, but to no avail. All the information obtained was similar. One moment, the enemy was above Amsterdam, the next, above Bruges, then at sea. The German fighter pilots were disoriented, not knowing what to do or where to go. One thing was certain: a horde of British aircraft was approaching. The Royal Air Force had succeeded in deceiving the German defenses by using the secret window technology for the first time. This technology was developed in 1942 by the Welsh researcher Joan Curran, but the British had decided to keep it secret for fear that it might fall into Nazi hands. However, a year later, it was evident that Germany was no longer able to launch major attacks against British cities as it had in the past. Window was an effective but very simple technology. Strips of aluminum foil created the illusion of large formations of false aircraft, saturating radar screens with false echoes. Bomber crews dropped the bundles of strips through the traps. These bundles scattered in the sky, generating false readings on German radars. Later, German pilots recalled detecting non-existent targets and chasing them without ever reaching them. The British bombers had managed to cross the North Sea separately to converge 80 miles from the German coast at a place called Position A, where they formed a massive fleet. They then turned southeast, passing by the Dutch or Danish coasts to avoid concentrations of German defenses. At the same time, 11 Mosquito planes attacked the cities of Kiel, Bremen, Duisburg, and Leer to sow confusion. The bulk of the bombers entered Germany from the north. Thanks to the window technology, the Nazi defense line had been breached, and the British planes had a free path to Hamburg. The city had been chosen to start Operation Gomorrah for several reasons. The condition of its buildings made it particularly vulnerable, with a large number of wooden or fire-resistant materials being poor. These characteristics made it exceptionally susceptible to incendiary bombs. Furthermore, Hamburg was the second largest city in Germany, and its shipbuilding industry made it a priority target. Hamburg also had other industrial targets of interest, such as oil refineries, electrical engineering workshops, and asbestos factories. Its geographical location, relatively close to bomber bases in Great Britain, offered planes a shorter flight with less exposure to anti-aircraft fire and German fighters. And, located near the coast and a major river, it was easier to spot at night. For 4 nights and 2 days, the British Royal Air Force and the United States 8th Air Force would devastate Germany's second-largest city. At that time, the RAF's bombing operations chief, Air Marshal Arthur Harris, was leaving a deep mark on the war. The first bombing with 1,000 planes over the German city of Cologne, known as Operation Millennium, had marked a turning point for the Royal Air Force. Nearly a year later, in March 1943, the British launched a 4-month campaign against industrial cities in the Ruhr Valley. The Battle of the Ruhr was a success. Many German cities were attacked without British crews suffering significant losses. After the Ruhr attack, the RAF High Commands concentrated their efforts on Hamburg. By July that year, bomber navigation capability had been improved thanks to the G system and the implementation of the new airborne H-2S radar. In addition, the US Air Force would join Operation Gomorrah to carry out daytime precision bombings targeting aircraft engine factories and submarine shipyards to support the Allied Navy fighting in the Atlantic. Everything was ready to attack the city, and the Allied military leaders were full of optimism. But the pilots tasked with carrying out the mission were not as confident when boarding the planes. Pilots like Bill McCrea, who flew a Lancaster from Squadron 57, said they felt physically sick 10 minutes before takeoff, worried about what was going to happen. And their fear, like that of many others, was justified. The city they were going to attack was heavily defended by 54 heavy anti-aircraft batteries, 26 light ones, and 22 searchlights. A reinforced concrete tower protected the downtown and the port with 16 flak cannons of 128 millimeters. Additionally, other 128mm cannons and 48 units of 105mm could be quickly deployed by train, accompanied by armed defense barges on the Elbe. Many pilots had seen their comrades die during previous incursions over Hamburg. Some commanders even considered it would have been safer to attack other targets. But Arthur Harris was a tough man, made for tough times, and firmly believed in the window technology. He thought the time had come to bomb the city. Arthur Harris was not wrong. The Royal Air Force could not have chosen a better night to launch the attack. Flight conditions were perfect, moonlight was faint, and the Luftwaffe's response was weak. Although at one point it managed to jam the G signals, that night all German efforts were ineffective. During the flight, 45 bombers had to return to their bases due to mechanical failures, but that represented only 6% of the units, which was within the average for an operation of this magnitude. They encountered only a few German night fighters, F-110, which were shot down by 2 Lancasters. That night, luck favored the British. The RAF had planned for a group of Mosquitoes to attack German night fighter airfields to distract them, but due to fog, only one could take off. However, this did not harm them. On the contrary, the absence of attack contributed to the confusion at the Luftwaffe command post. At 12:20 a.m., the bomber groups gathered at position A and formed 6 waves. The formation was led by 6 Lancaster Pathfinder planes, whose mission was to identify and mark the targets for the attack. 20 minutes later, the navigators of these planes detected the silhouette of the German coast on their H-2S radars and began dropping the first target markers, incendiary munitions that ignited at 300 meters altitude, illuminating the night sky in yellow, visible for several kilometers. The first markers indicated the correct route for the rest of the group to follow. Seeing them, the pilots tightened the formation. Meanwhile, the Baccarat Pathfinder planes of the main group continued dropping markers to guide the rest. But the British bombers were not the only ones attracted by the flashes in the night. A German Dornier Do-217 bomber shot down a Halifax belonging to the 5th wave, but another British plane then destroyed it. This did not prevent the bombers from making their final turn over the village of Kellinghusen, 27 miles from Hamburg. Flying over it, some planes began dropping propaganda leaflets, and 6 Wellingtons detached from the main group to drop naval mines at the mouth of the Elbe. The punishment against Germany was coming from the skies. There were 7 minutes left before the fire would fall on the city. A little earlier, at 12:33 a.m., the air raid siren sounded for the first time in Hamburg. The Secretary of State broadcast an urgent message on the radio, warning that a large number of aircraft were heading toward Hamburg to bomb it. He insisted that all citizens take shelter immediately. Then, all the city's exterior lights were turned off. Only the sky was illuminated by the power of the anti-aircraft searchlights. But after several months of false alarms, many citizens preferred to stay in bed. Some later recounted that it seemed ridiculous to them to remain constantly on alert when nothing ever happened. Others testified that they had not sought shelter because it seemed foolish to lose a peaceful night's sleep over the threat of an attack that probably would not occur. Nevertheless, some civilian workers decided to go to their posts, and others took their families to the shelters. Those people were able to observe how the sky suddenly lit up with yellow flares, and behind them they could hear the humming of approaching engines. Then they saw red and green signal bombs falling, which emitted such a bright light that reading was easy. These lights were nothing other than the flares dropped by the Pathfinder planes of the first wave. They first dropped yellow markers for the other planes to follow. Then they dropped red markers to indicate the specific areas where the targets were located. And finally, they used green markers to confirm that the red flares had indeed fallen in the right places. The Hamburg police headquarters recorded the first sounds of planes over the city at 00:51. It was then that the Nazi anti-aircraft batteries began firing. But the radar-guided guns had scrambled screens and were unable to aim properly, only firing randomly, following the sound of engines. Some batteries did not fire at all, content to watch helplessly. On their side, the British pilots were delighted. For some, this night was the only time during the entire war that they were able to carry out a bombing without being harassed by enemy anti-aircraft fire. The main objective of the attack was the city center and the shipyards across the Elbe River, but many Pathfinders took time to arrive. The first markers began to fall at 00:51, but most of Squadron 83 did not arrive until 00:59, when many markers had already gone out. Despite this, 151 Lancasters arrived shortly after 1 a.m. There were still 39 flares lit, mostly in the shipyard area, which was well marked. Other markers fell to the east and in the Altona district. The center of Hamburg was spared, at least during this first raid. The pilots could see the terrain with absolute clarity, allowing them to identify where the flares had fallen. The lack of resistance from the completely disorganized German defenses allowed them to stabilize their planes and drop the bombs. Some pilots later said it took them only 20 seconds to get into position and begin the attack. At 1:02, the attack began. From the north, Lancaster bombers started dropping high-explosive bombs such as 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs and 4,000-pound blockbusters, grimly nicknamed cookies, on the east-northwest zones of the city like Hamm, Ellebeck, Borgfelder, and the outskirts of Hohenfelder. The goal was to break roofs, doors, and windows, create craters in the streets, and destroy pipes and water systems to make it harder to extinguish later fires. Civilians on the ground heard the detonations and realized too late that this time it was not a false alarm. Many did not believe their city would be bombed and now ran desperately toward the shelters. They had become accustomed to watching from their roofs and balconies the spectacle of anti-aircraft fire repelling attacks on military industry factories. This complacency was now going to cost them their lives. This time, the anti-aircraft fire was so sporadic and ineffective that several British pilots pretended to make a training pass before bombing precisely. To deceive the enemy, the Germans were forced to light flares in empty fields, which worked and fooled some squadrons. Other planes dropped their bombs too early, causing the creep-back phenomenon, which prompted subsequent planes to bomb the same spot. But despite these small difficulties, most bombs fell on Altona and the Eimsbüttel district. The bombing lasted only a few minutes, but it left the ground ready for the third wave. A third wave of planes, this time composed of Halifax and Lancaster bombers, began dropping incendiary bombs made of magnesium, white phosphorus, and primitive napalm. The areas of Hamm, Barmbek, and Wandsbek had many wooden or mixed structure buildings. which caused multiple fires that severely damaged the city's infrastructure. Hamburg had 40,000 firefighters ready to fight the fires, but the British knew they would try to put them out, so they sent a fourth wave of planes that again dropped explosive bombs on partially destroyed areas to collapse weakened walls and spread the flames. Then, they continued dropping incendiary bombs to ensure the fire could not be contained. Thick smoke rose into the sky and disoriented the British pilots. For this reason, when the fifth wave of planes began bombing to keep the fire active, many bombs fell on neighboring residential areas such as Wandsbek, Marienthal, and part of Eimsbüttel. Many German soldiers saw from their positions the streets where their families lived being bombed. Others watched in disbelief as their homes caught fire with their wives and children still inside. Their only hope was that they had found shelter in the cellars. Meanwhile, German night fighters were absent. Only a few prowled near the British formation, disoriented and too scared to attack. The anti-aircraft defense was no more effective. The Luftwaffe fired 50,000 anti-aircraft shells but managed to shoot down only 3 British bombers. A tragic end for their crews, but such a low number that it filled the Royal Air Force's high command with joy. On the ground, the fires began to merge and caused unusual weather phenomena. Strong winds pushed residents trying to flee into the streets. Hot air rose into the atmosphere where it cooled and condensed to fall as black rain that covered the entire city. At least there was no firestorm, for now. The planes continued bombing without opposition, and the sixth group focused on correcting precision and dropping delayed bombs without being disturbed, which would explode while firefighters and rescuers came to help Hamburg's civilians. At 1:50 a.m., the planes stopped bombing. It had taken them only 48 minutes to drop 2,300 tons of explosives and unleash hell on Hamburg, a new record. It was only now, once the bombing was over, that the German fighters took action. Without window technology on the return path, the German radars started working again, and the British lost 6 more planes, a number representing half of the total losses. But that did not prevent their return home from continuing. At 4 a.m., the bombers began landing on English soil, where the crews were welcomed with a hearty breakfast, including as many eggs and bacon as they wanted. They then went to sleep. Their morale was at its highest thanks to the huge success they had just achieved. But while the British pilots rested, Hamburg burned. The water and gas supply systems were destroyed, and the Air Defense Control Center had also been hit during the bombing, forcing its evacuation. Shortly after, sirens sounded to declare the end of the attack, but some feared this bombing was only the prelude to something bigger. Karl Kaufmann, the Nazi governor of the city, was among those who feared the British planes would return the next night to finish their work. He therefore declared a state of emergency, mobilized the SS and Gestapo so that firefighters would focus on the most at-risk sites. Despite efforts, many houses continued to burn for weeks because of coal deposits. Tens of thousands of buildings were damaged. Entire neighborhoods were razed. The telephone exchange had caught fire, and the rubble blocked the passage of fire trucks in the city streets. Some bombs fell on the Blom and Voss shipyards, where 3 submarines were destroyed. The death toll was estimated at 1,500. Tens of thousands more lost their homes and desperately sought shelter. Some wanted to flee the city, but Kaufmann forbade citizens from leaving, fearing they would spread information about what had happened. He did not yet know it, but his actions would soon have fatal consequences.